What happens when three teenage bullies decide to sexually humiliate the quiet Asian girl at their Pennsylvania high school? They discover that 16-year-old Natalie Lim isn't just any ordinary student. She's the daughter of a decorated Army colonel who taught her that respect is earned and sometimes demanded. In less than 30 seconds, without throwing a single punch, this veteran's daughter turned the tables on her tormentors so decisively that they were left crying in front of the entire school. But what happened next was even more shocking. Her father had a different idea about justice that would transform these bullies into protectors and teach the town of Springdale that real strength comes from discipline, honor, and second chances. This is the incredible story of how one girl's military training and her family's wisdom created a miracle that changed an entire community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Springdale, Pennsylvania, as 16-year-old Natalie Lim adjusted her backpack straps and walked toward the imposing brick facade of Springdale High School. At exactly 5 feet 3 inches, with shoulder-length black hair pulled into a practical ponytail, she moved with a quiet confidence that most of her classmates mistook for shyness. Her dark eyes held an alertness that came from years of military, family discipline, scanning her environment with the same methodical attention her father had taught her since childhood. Situational awareness, Nat, Colonel Benjamin Lim would say during their morning runs around Liberty Commons. Know your surroundings, know your exits, know your capabilities. At 42, Benjamin carried himself with the bearing of a man who had commanded respect in 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. His graying temples and the subtle scar along his left jawline told stories of service that he rarely shared, even with his family. But the lessons he'd learned about survival, strategy, and standing up for what's right, those he passed down to his daughter every single day. The Lim family had moved to Springdale 8 months ago when Benjamin's 20-year Army career ended. With an honorable retirement, the transition from military bases to small-town civilian life hadn't been easy for any of them. Christina Lim, Natalie's mother, had found work as the school nurse at Springdale High, her gentle demeanor and medical expertise quickly earning respect from both students and faculty. Ma Dorothy, Benjamin's 70-year-old mother, had moved in with them after Natalie's grandfather passed, bringing her fierce protective instincts and traditional wisdom to anchor the family through their adjustment period. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down, Ma would say, in her accented English, mixing Korean proverbs with practical advice. But sometimes, little one, you must stick out to protect others. Natalie understood the delicate balance her grandmother described. At Springdale High, she had deliberately kept a low profile, focusing on her studies and avoiding the complex social hierarchies that governed teenage life. Her grades were exceptional, straight A's in advanced placement courses, but she participated minimally in extracurricular activities. The debate team had tried to recruit her after she'd effortlessly dismantled opposing arguments during a class discussion about foreign policy, but Natalie had politely declined. She preferred observing to performing, analyzing to socializing. The school's social structure was brutally simple and rigidly enforced. At the apex stood the athletes, particularly the football team, whose success on Friday nights determined the town's mood for weeks at a time. Springdale took its high school football seriously. The team had won 3 consecutive state championships under Coach Henderson's leadership, and the entire community basked in reflected glory. Below the athletic elite came the cheerleaders, the honor students who also happened to be wealthy, and various other groups arranged in descending order of social currency. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the outliers, kids who were too poor, too different, too quiet, or too smart for their own good. Natalie had unconsciously placed herself in this category, though her family's middle-class stability and her academic achievements should have elevated her status. Her Asian heritage, military family background, and reserved personality created a combination that the established cliques found difficult to categorize and therefore chose to ignore. This social invisibility had served her well for most of the school year. She could move through the halls largely unnoticed, complete her coursework without interference, and return home to the structured environment that felt familiar and safe. Her parents had taught her that high school was temporary, that real life began after graduation, and that maintaining dignity was more important than achieving popularity. But invisibility, Natalie was about to learn, could be a double-edged sword. Maverick Stone ruled Springdale High's social landscape with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. At 17, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the broad shoulders and confident swagger that came from being the football team's star quarterback. His dirty blonde hair was always perfectly styled, and his blue eyes held a calculating intelligence that he used primarily to identify weaknesses in others. Maverick wore his Letterman jacket like armor, the patches and pins announcing his achievements to anyone within visual range. The Stone family had lived in Springdale for 3 generations. Maverick's grandfather had been a local business owner. His father managed the town's largest car dealership, and his mother served on the school board. This generational influence created a protective bubble around Maverick that extended to his carefully chosen inner circle. Teachers gave him benefit of the doubt, administrators overlooked minor infractions, and parents throughout the community spoke of him as a good kid from a good family. Easton Price served as Maverick's lieutenant, a role he had cultivated since middle school through unwavering loyalty and strategic intelligence. Slightly shorter than Maverick at 5'11", Easton compensated for his secondary status with an aggressive mean streak that made him useful for tasks Maverick preferred not to handle personally. His red hair and pale complexion flushed easily when he was angry, which happened frequently. Easton's family owned a successful construction company, providing him with both social standing and physical strength developed through summers working job sites. Knox Fisher completed the triumvirate as the follower, the one who laughed loudest at their jokes and carried out their less sophisticated schemes. At 16, Knox was stockier than his friends, with brown hair that never looked quite clean and a perpetual expression of barely contained aggression. His family struggled financially compared to the others, making him simultaneously grateful for inclusion in their group and resentful of his subordinate position. Knox's eagerness to prove himself often led to poor decision-making, a trait that Maverick exploited when he needed someone to take risks or blame. Together, they had perfected a system of social terrorism that operated just below the threshold of serious administrative intervention. They specialized in psychological intimidation, public humiliation disguised as joking around, social isolation campaigns that left targets friendless and confused, and carefully orchestrated incidents that could always be explained away as misunderstandings or accidents. Their victims were chosen strategically. They avoided anyone with sufficient social standing to fight back effectively, anyone whose parents had real influence in the community, or anyone whose treatment might generate unwanted attention from faculty. Instead, they focused on students who seemed vulnerable, isolated, or different enough to justify their treatment as somehow deserved. For 8 months, Natalie Lim had successfully avoided their notice through careful behavior modification and strategic timing. She had learned their schedules, identified their favorite hunting grounds, and developed alternative routes through the school that minimized contact. Her military family background had taught her the value of reconnaissance and tactical planning, skills that served her well in navigating the social minefield of high school. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late April, as spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows of Springdale High's main hallway, Natalie's carefully maintained invisibility was about to end. The first sign of trouble came during third period chemistry, when she overheard Easton and Knox whispering behind her during a lab exercise. Their conversation was just loud enough for her to catch fragments, something about the quiet Asian girl, thinks she's better than everyone, and time to bring her down a notch. Natalie kept her expression neutral and her focus on her experiment, but her father's training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, plan your response, control what you can control. The second warning came at lunch, when she noticed Maverick watching her from across the cafeteria. His attention felt different from casual observation, more focused, more predatory. When their eyes met briefly, he smiled in a way that made her stomach tighten with unease. Natalie finished eating quickly and spent the rest of lunch period in the library, but the feeling of being hunted followed her through the afternoon. By the time her final class ended, Natalie had confirmed her suspicions. The three boys were coordinating their movements to track her location throughout the day. They had positioned themselves strategically near her locker by the main exit and along her usual route to the student parking lot where her mother would pick her up after her shift in the nurse's office. As she gathered her books and prepared to leave the building, Natalie felt the familiar calm that her father had taught her to cultivate in stressful situations. When you can't avoid conflict, he had said during one of their training sessions in their backyard, you prepare for it. You stay calm, you stay smart, and you remember that the goal is always to end the situation as quickly and safely as possible. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Natalie stepped outside, her backpack securely positioned and her mind running through contingency plans. She could see her mother's car in the parking lot beyond the main building, but the most direct path would take her through an area where she had spotted Maverick and his friends congregating near the bike racks. Alternative routes would add several minutes to her journey and might actually provide more opportunities for confrontation in less visible areas. Sometimes, Natalie realized, the best strategy was to walk straight through danger rather than around it. She adjusted her backpack straps, checked her phone to confirm the time, and began walking toward the parking lot with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. Behind her, she could hear the casual conversations and laughter of other students leaving school, the normal sounds of a normal day that was about to become anything but normal. "Hey there, quiet girl." Maverick's voice carried across the courtyard, with false friendliness that immediately put Natalie on high alert. "We've been wanting to talk to you." Natalie continued walking without changing her pace or acknowledging the comment. Her father had taught her that engagement often escalated situations unnecessarily, and that projecting confidence through body language could sometimes deter aggressors who were looking for easy targets. "I'm talking to you." Easton's voice was sharper, more demanding. "Don't be rude." When Natalie still didn't respond, she heard footsteps quickening behind her. The sound of pursuit triggered every instinct her father had trained into her, but she maintained her steady pace toward the parking lot where safety waited in the form of her mother's familiar presence. "You think you're too good to talk to us?" Knox's voice held the particular whine of someone whose pride had been wounded. "We're just trying to be friendly." Natalie reached the edge of the courtyard, perhaps 50 yards from the parking lot, when she realized they had moved to intercept her path. Maverick appeared to her left, Easton to her right, and Knox directly ahead, forming a loose triangle that would force her to stop or physically push through them. "There we go," Maverick said with satisfaction. "Now we can have a proper conversation." For For the first time since leaving the building, Natalie stopped walking and looked directly at her three would-be tormentors. Her dark eyes were calm, alert, and completely unafraid, an expression that gave Maverick a moment of unexpected unease. "What do you want?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the same controlled tone she had heard her father use when addressing subordinates who had disappointed him. The question seemed to catch them off guard. They had expected fear, anger, or pleading, any of the emotional responses that had worked so well with previous targets. Instead, they found themselves facing someone who seemed to be evaluating them rather than being intimidated by them. "We want to get to know you better," Maverick said, recovering his confidence. "You've been here almost a year, and you act like you're too good for the rest of us. That's not very friendly." "I'm not interested in being friends," Natalie replied matter-of-factly. "Now please move so I can get to my ride." The directness of her response and her complete lack of deference triggered something aggressive in all three boys. They were accustomed to social interactions built on hierarchy and submission, where their status commanded automatic respect and compliance. Natalie's calm rejection of their authority felt like a personal insult that demanded correction. "See, that's your problem right there," Easton said, stepping closer. "You think you're better than everyone else because you get good grades and your daddy was in the army or whatever, but you're not special, China girl." "I'm Korean American," Natalie corrected automatically, then immediately regretted engaging with the racist comment. Her father had taught her not to educate people who were determined to remain ignorant. "Oh, excuse me," Knox said with exaggerated sarcasm. "Korean. Big difference. Still just another foreign girl who needs to learn her place." The racial element of their harassment crystallized something cold and dangerous in Natalie's chest. These boys didn't just see her as a convenient target. They saw her as fundamentally inferior, someone whose dignity was negotiable because of her heritage. The realization filled her with the same controlled fury she had seen in her father's eyes when he talked about fighting for the freedoms that people like Knox took for granted. "Move," she said again, but this time her voice carried an edge that made all three boys take notice. Instead of moving, Maverick smiled with the particular cruelty of someone who sensed weakness and intended to exploit it. "Or what? You'll tell your mommy. Maybe have Daddy come fight your battles for you." The courtyard around them had grown quieter as other students sensed the tension and either moved away quickly or gathered at a safe distance to watch whatever was about to unfold. Natalie could see several phones being pulled out, ready to record whatever humiliation these boys had planned for her. "You know what I think?" Maverick continued, emboldened by the growing audience. "I think it's time someone taught you about American customs, starting with how to show proper respect to your betters." What happened next would be talked about in Springdale for years to come, but in that moment, as Maverick reached toward her, with obvious intent to humiliate her in front of the entire school, Natalie Lim simply smiled and prepared to give him exactly the education he was asking for. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maverick's hand was halfway to Natalie's shoulder when she spoke in a voice so quietly controlled that he had to lean forward to hear her. "You have 3 seconds to step back," she said, her dark eyes fixed on his with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere much older and more dangerous than a 16-year-old girl. 1. Maverick laughed, mistaking her countdown for some kind of desperate bluff. Around them, the circle of watching students had grown larger, phones held high to capture what they expected to be another humiliating takedown of an unpopular kid. The afternoon sun caught the metal of the bike racks behind them, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard. 2. Easton and Knox flanked closer, sensing their leader's confidence and feeding off the energy of the crowd. This was how it always worked. Public humiliation that would establish their dominance and ensure the target never challenged them again. Maverick's fingers brushed against Natalie's shoulder, preparing to grab her backpack strap and spin her around for whatever degrading spectacle he had planned. 3. What happened next unfolded with such precise efficiency that most witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events. Colonel Benjamin Lim had spent countless hours teaching his daughter that real self-defense wasn't about fighting. It was about ending a threat so completely and quickly that fighting never became necessary. Natalie's left hand shot up and caught Maverick's wrist in a grip that her father had taught her during their weekend training sessions behind their house. The same fingers that held pencils delicately during calculus exams now applied pressure to specific points that sent lightning bolts of pain up Maverick's arm. Simultaneously, her right hand struck his solar plexus with a precision palm strike that doubled him over, gasping for air he couldn't catch. But Natalie wasn't finished. As Maverick bent forward in pain and shock, she pivoted on her left foot and swept his legs with a movement so fluid it looked like she was simply stepping aside. Maverick hit the pavement hard, his Letterman jacket providing little cushioning against the unforgiving concrete. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 2 seconds. Easton reacted first, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment at seeing his leader dropped so effortlessly. He lunged toward Natalie with his hands extended, intending to grab her and establish physical dominance through sheer size and strength. His approach was clumsy, telegraphed, driven more by emotion than strategy. Natalie sidestepped his rush with minimal movement, caught his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling past her into the bike racks. The metallic crash as Easton collided with the steel rails echoed across the now silent courtyard. He bounced off the racks and landed in a sprawling heap, his red hair disheveled and his confidence completely shattered. 4 seconds total. Knox, seeing both his friends neutralized in less time than it took to speak a complete sentence, hesitated fatally. His hesitation gave Natalie time to reset her position and face him directly. Knox was stockier and stronger than the others, but his uncertainty was visible in his posture and expression. "You can walk away," Natalie said quietly. "Never." Taking her eyes off him. "Your choice." Knox looked around at the crowd of students, all recording his humiliation in real time. His friends were groaning on the ground behind him, and this girl, this quiet, small girl he had dismissed as an easy target, was standing calmly with her backpack still perfectly positioned on her shoulders, not even breathing hard. But Knox's pride and fear of social embarrassment overrode his survival instincts. He charged forward with a wild swing that might have been effective in a bar fight, but was useless against someone who had been trained to read and counter aggressive movements. Natalie ducked under his punch, grabbed the front of his shirt, and executed a perfect judo throw that sent Knox flying over her shoulder. He landed flat on his back, with an impact that knocked all the air from his lungs, staring up at the sky, and wondering how his simple plan to intimidate a quiet girl had gone so catastrophically wrong. 6 seconds total. The courtyard fell into absolute silence, except for the sounds of 3 teenage boys gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened to them. Natalie stood in the center of the scene, completely composed, looking down at her fallen tormentors with an expression of mild disappointment rather than triumph. "You wanted to teach me about American customs," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Here's a lesson from a Korean-American military family. Respect is earned, not demanded. And dignity isn't something you can take from someone else." Maverick struggled to push himself up from the pavement, his face red from pain and humiliation. Around them, the crowd of students was buzzing with amazement and excitement, but their chatter felt distant and unimportant compared to the crushing weight of his social destruction. You can't," he gasped, still fighting to catch his breath. This isn't over. Natalie looked down at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Yes, it is, she said simply. It's over because you just learned that your actions have consequences. You can choose to learn from this, or you can choose to keep making the same mistakes. But either way, you're not going to bother me or anyone else in this school again. Easton had managed to extricate himself from the bike racks and was looking around frantically for some way to salvage the situation. His face was scratched from the metal railings and his shirt was torn, but his pride was damaged far worse than his body. You think this makes you tough, he said, trying to inject venom into his voice, but only managing to sound desperate. Wait until people hear about this. Nobody's going to want anything to do with you after you attacked us for no reason. The laugh that rippled through the crowd of watching students told Easton everything he needed to know about how his version of events would be received. Dozens of phones had recorded the entire incident, capturing Maverick's aggressive approach, the racial slurs, and Natalie's purely defensive response to their physical threats. Knox sat up slowly, his back aching from the impact with the pavement. Of the three friends, he looked the most shaken by what had happened. His usual aggressive bravado had been completely stripped away, leaving behind a confused and embarrassed teenage boy who suddenly understood that the world was more complicated than he had believed. "How did you?" he started to ask, then stopped. Himself, the question felt too much like admitting defeat, acknowledging that this girl possessed skills and knowledge that he couldn't understand or counter. "My father taught me that if you're going to threaten someone, you'd better be prepared for them to defend themselves," Natalie said. "He also taught me that real strength protects others instead of hurting them. Maybe you should think about what kind of strength you want to have." The crowd of students was beginning to disperse now that the excitement was over, but many lingered to get closer looks at the three boys who had just been comprehensively defeated by someone they had been planning to humiliate. The social dynamics of Springdale High School had shifted in less than 10 seconds, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed something significant. Principal Morrison pushed through the remaining crowd, alerted by a student who had run to the office when the confrontation began. Janet Morrison had been an educator for 15 years and thought she had seen every variation of teenage conflict, but the scene that greeted her in the courtyard was unlike anything in her experience. Three of the school's most prominent students were sitting on the pavement in various states of dishevelment and distress, while Natalie Lim stood nearby, looking as composed as if she had just finished a pleasant conversation. The contrast was so stark that Morrison had to take a moment to process what she was seeing. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers from teenagers before anyone else could speak. Jennifer Walsh, a junior who had been standing near the bike racks when the incident began, stepped forward with her phone still in her hand. Maverick and his friends cornered Natalie and started saying racist stuff to her, Jennifer said clearly. They were trying to grab her and she defended herself. "I got most of it on video if you want to see." Principal Morrison looked around at the faces of the students who remained, reading their expressions and body language with the skill of someone who had spent her career navigating teenage social dynamics. The story was written clearly in their eyes. Sympathy for Natalie, embarrassment for the three boys, and a collective sense that justice had been served. "Is anyone injured?" Morrison asked, though she could see that while the boys were clearly shaken and embarrassed, none of them appeared to be seriously hurt. "Just their pride," someone in the crowd said quietly, earning a few muffled laughs. Morrison turned her attention to Natalie, studying the girl who had somehow managed to handle three larger opponents without sustaining so much as a scratch or wrinkle in her clothing. "Miss Lim, I'm going to need you to come to my office so we can discuss what happened here," she said. "And I'll need to call your parents." "Yes, ma'am," Natalie replied politely. "My mother is in the nurse's office, if that would be more convenient." The respectful tone and immediate compliance reminded Morrison that Natalie had never been involved in any disciplinary issues during her time at Springdale High. Her academic record was exemplary. Her teachers spoke highly of her character, and now she was involved in what appeared to be a clear case of self-defense against students who had a growing reputation for problematic behavior. As they walked toward the main building, Morrison noticed that Natalie moved with a quiet confidence that seemed much more mature than her 16 years. There was something about her posture and demeanor that suggested this wasn't the first time she had dealt with conflict, though Morrison suspected it might be the first time she had dealt with it so publicly and decisively. Behind them, Maverick, Easton and Knox were slowly getting to their feet, helped by a few friends who looked more embarrassed than sympathetic. The social ecosystem of Springdale High had just experienced a seismic shift, and everyone involved was beginning to understand that the consequences would extend far beyond whatever administrative response the school decided to implement. In the parking lot, Christina Lim looked up from the medical supply inventory she was completing in her car and noticed a crowd of students gathered in the courtyard. Something about the tension in their body language made her abandon her paperwork and walk toward the school building to investigate. She arrived at the main entrance just as Principal Morrison and Natalie approached from the other direction. Christina immediately assessed her daughter's condition, unharmed, composed, but with an alertness in her expression that suggested significant recent stress. "Mrs. Lim, I'm glad you're still here," Principal Morrison said. "We need to discuss an incident involving Natalie and some other students. Could you join us in my office?" Christina looked at her daughter, reading volumes in the slight tension. Around Natalie's eyes and the way she held her shoulders, 16 years of military family life had taught Christina to recognize when her daughter had been forced to handle a serious situation, and she felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. "Of course," Christina said. "Nat, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," Natalie replied, and Christina heard the truth in her voice along with something else, a quiet satisfaction that suggested her daughter had successfully applied the lessons her father had been teaching her. As they entered the school building, Christina noticed Maverick Stone limping slightly as he walked in the opposite direction with his friends. She had treated Maverick in the nurse's office several times for minor sports injuries and knew him to be arrogant and disrespectful, though he was careful to hide those qualities from adults who might report back to his parents. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Christina's mind, and she felt a fierce surge of maternal pride mixed with concern for the complications that were sure to follow. Her daughter had clearly been forced to defend herself, and based on Maverick's condition compared to Natalie's perfect composure, that defense had been remarkably effective. Principal Morrison's office felt smaller with 3 people in it, but the atmosphere was surprisingly calm given the circumstances. Morrison had learned over the years that the most serious incidents often involved the quietest students, and she approached the conversation with careful attention to details and context. "Natalie, I want you to tell me exactly what happened, starting from the beginning," Morrison said. "Take your time and include everything you think is relevant." Natalie recounted the events with the precision and clarity that came from her father's training in situational reporting. She described the harassment building throughout the day, the boys' positioning to intercept her path, the racist comments, and their physical aggression that had forced her to defend herself. "I gave them multiple opportunities to back down," she concluded. "I only used force when they made it clear they intended to assault me in front of the other students." Morrison nodded, making notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. The story aligned perfectly with what she had observed at the scene and what other students had reported. More importantly, it aligned with her growing understanding of the different characters involved in the incident. "Mrs. Lim, I assume Natalie has had some kind of self-defense training?" Morrison asked. Christina smiled slightly. "Her father is retired Army. He believes in being prepared for any situation." "That's evident," Morrison said dryly. 3 football players, and not one of them managed to land a hit. As they continued discussing the incident and its implications, none of them could have predicted how this single confrontation would transform not just the lives of everyone directly involved, but the entire culture of Springdale High School and the community beyond its walls. The real story was just beginning. By the time Colonel Benjamin Lim's steel-toed boots echoed through the main hallway of Springdale High School, word of the courtyard incident had spread through the building. Like wildfire, students whispered in clusters near lockers, teachers exchanged concerned glances in doorways, and the normal after-school energy had been replaced with an electric tension that made everyone stop and stare when the imposing figure of Natalie's father appeared. At 6 feet tall, with the rigid posture of 20 years in the army, Benjamin commanded attention without saying a word. His civilian clothes, dark jeans, a pressed button-down shirt, and a worn leather jacket, couldn't hide the bearing of a man who had led soldiers through combat zones. The scar along his jawline caught the fluorescent light as he strode purposefully toward the administrative offices, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with protective focus. Christina had called him immediately after the meeting with Principal Morrison concluded, using the code phrase they had established years ago for situations requiring his immediate attention. "Nat handled herself well today, but you should come in," meant their daughter had been forced to use her training, and Benjamin needed to assess the broader implications. He found them in Principal Morrison's office, where the discussion had evolved from incident report to damage control strategy. Natalie sat with perfect posture, her school bag at her feet, and her hands folded calmly in her lap. Christina had positioned herself slightly forward, her protective instincts engaged but controlled. Principal Morrison looked like a woman trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain without stepping on any landmines. "Colonel Lim," Morrison said, rising to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming in so quickly." Benjamin's handshake was firm but brief, his attention immediately shifting to his daughter. He read her body language with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating soldiers after difficult missions. Natalie was composed but alert, showing no signs of physical injury or emotional trauma, but there was something in her eyes that told him she had crossed a threshold today, from training to application, from theory to reality. "Nat," he said, quietly, and she looked up at him with the same direct gaze she had inherited from his side of the family. "I'm okay, Dad," she said, and he heard the truth in her voice along with something new, a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could handle herself when it mattered. Benjamin took the remaining chair and listened as Principal Morrison summarized the incident, the witness statements, and the school's preliminary response. His expression remained neutral throughout the recitation, but Christina noticed the slight tightening around his eyes when Morrison described the racial slurs and the boys' attempt to physically assault their daughter. "Let me make sure I understand," Benjamin said when Morrison finished. "3 older students cornered my daughter, subjected her to racist harassment, and then attempted to physically assault her in front of witnesses, and she defended herself, using minimal necessary force." "That's correct," Morrison confirmed. "Several students recorded the incident, and their accounts are consistent with Natalie's description." "And the 3 boys?" "Bruised egos mostly, some minor scrapes from contact with the pavement and bike racks, but nothing requiring medical attention." Benjamin nodded slowly, processing the information through the lens of his military experience and his understanding of teenage social dynamics. He had trained Natalie to defend herself precisely because he knew that predators, whether on a battlefield or in a high school, tended to target those they perceived as vulnerable. The fact that she had neutralized 3 attackers without seriously injuring any of them told him that his training had been effective and that her judgment had remained sound under pressure. "What happens next?" he asked. Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented nature of the situation. Technically, any physical altercation requires suspension for all parties involved, regardless of circumstances. But given the evidence and the clear self-defense nature of Natalie's actions, I'm prepared to classify this as justified force in response to assault. And the 3 boys. That's more complicated. The Stone family has already called demanding answers. Maverick's father seems to believe his son was the victim of an unprovoked attack by, and I quote, "some martial arts girl who should be expelled." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but Christina saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had seen that look before, usually right before her husband made decisions that had far-reaching consequences. Mr. Stone might want to review the video evidence before making public statements about his son's behavior, Benjamin said quietly. I assume you'll be conducting a thorough investigation. Of course. But Colonel Lim, I need you to understand that this situation has the potential to become very complicated very quickly. The 3 boys involved are prominent students from influential families. Their version of events may not align with the evidence, but they have resources and connections that could make things difficult for Natalie. Benjamin studied Principal Morrison for a long moment, recognizing a decent person trying to navigate political pressures while doing the right thing. His years in the army had taught him to identify allies quickly, and he sensed that Morrison wanted to support Natalie but needed backup to stand against the inevitable pressure campaign. Principal Morrison, I appreciate your honesty, he said. Let me be equally direct. My daughter was trained to defend herself because the world can be dangerous, especially for young women who might be perceived as easy targets. She used those skills today exactly as intended, to stop a threat with minimal force and maximum effectiveness. He leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. If anyone wants to characterize legitimate self-defense as aggression, they're welcome to review the evidence with law enforcement present. I'm confident that any objective analysis will support Natalie's actions completely. Morrison nodded, feeling some of her anxiety ease. Having a parent who understood both the legal and practical aspects of the situation would make her job significantly easier. There is one more thing, she said carefully. The incident has created quite a stir among the student body. Natalie's effectiveness has earned her considerable respect, but it's also disrupted the existing social order. Some students are excited about seeing the bullies get their comeuppance, while others are worried about potential retaliation. Retaliation? Christina asked, her maternal instincts sharpening. Not physical, Morrison clarified quickly, but social ostracism, rumor campaigns, attempts to turn other students against Natalie. The kind of psychological warfare that teenagers can be very good at. Benjamin exchanged a look with his daughter, reading volumes in her slight nod. Natalie had considered this possibility and was prepared for it. But she was also 16 years old and shouldn't have to navigate such complexities alone. What do you recommend? He asked Morrison. Honestly, I think the best thing might be for Natalie to maintain her normal routine and let the situation settle naturally. Most of the student body seems to view her as the victim who successfully defended herself. That's actually a pretty powerful position to hold. As they continued discussing practical strategies for the coming days, none of them noticed the black sedan that pulled into the school parking lot, or the woman in a business suit who stepped out and walked purposefully toward the main entrance. Detective Sarah Chen had been with the Springdale Police Department for 8 years, long enough to recognize when a seemingly simple incident had the potential to become a community-defining event. The initial report had come from an anonymous tip, probably a parent who had seen the video footage their child recorded, describing an assault at the high school that required investigation. Chen was Korean-American herself, raised in a military family, and had experienced enough playground politics to understand the deeper currents flowing beneath what appeared to be a straightforward case of teenage conflict. When she watched the cell phone footage that had already begun circulating on social media, she saw something that concerned her far more than a simple schoolyard fight. She saw a pattern of predatory behavior that had likely been developing for months or years, culminating in a moment when the predators had finally chosen the wrong target. More troubling was her recognition that this incident, handled poorly, could fracture the community along lines of race, class, and social influence. Detective Chen's appearance in Principal Morrison's office doorway brought the family conference to an abrupt halt. Her badge was visible on her belt, and her expression was professionally neutral but alert. Principal Morrison, I'm Detective Chen with Springdale PD. I need to speak with you about an incident reported at your school today. The room's atmosphere shifted immediately. What had been a family and school matter was now officially a police investigation, with all the complications and potential consequences that implied. Of course, Detective, Morrison said, rising from her desk. This is the Lim family, Colonel Benjamin Lim, his wife Christina, and their daughter Natalie, who was involved in the incident. Chen's eyes met Benjamin's with the mutual recognition of two people who had served their communities in different but related capacities. She also noted Natalie's composed demeanor and Christina's protective positioning, reading family dynamics. With the skill of someone trained to assess situations quickly, I've reviewed the preliminary reports and some video footage, Chen said. I'd like to speak with each of you separately to get a complete picture of what happened. Are we looking at charges? Benjamin asked directly. That depends on what the investigation reveals, Chen replied, but I can tell you that the evidence I've seen so far suggests clear self-defense on Natalie's part. My bigger concern is ensuring that everyone involved understands the seriousness of what occurred and that appropriate measures are taken to prevent escalation. Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over her. Having law enforcement involvement might actually help contain the situation rather than complicate it, especially if Detective Chen's preliminary assessment supported Natalie's version of events. Detective, would it be helpful if I arranged for the 3 male students to come in for interviews as well? Morrison asked. It would be necessary, Chen replied. I'll also need copies of any video evidence and statements from witnesses. As they began coordinating the logistics of the investigation, Benjamin found himself impressed by Detective Chen's professional approach and her obvious understanding of the cultural and social dynamics at play. This wasn't going to be a whitewash or a rush to judgment. It was going to be a thorough examination of facts that would either vindicate his daughter or reveal aspects of the situation he didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, in the school parking lot, Maverick Stone sat in the passenger seat of his father's BMW, while Richard Stone paced angrily beside the car, his phone pressed to his ear as he made calls to school board members, local politicians, and anyone else who might have influence over the situation. This is completely unacceptable, Richard was saying to whoever would listen. My son was attacked by a student who obviously has extensive martial arts training. This girl is a weapon, and she has no business being in school with normal kids. Maverick slumped lower in his seat, acutely aware that his father's outrage was based on a version of events that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. The racist comments, the attempted assault, the public humiliation he had tried to inflict on Natalie, none of that would factor into his father's narrative of victimization. For the first time since the incident, Maverick began to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond social embarrassment. The police were now involved. There was video evidence of everything that had happened, and his family's influence might not be enough to make this problem disappear. Easton and Knox were having similar realizations as they sat with their own families, trying to explain how 3 athletes had been effortlessly defeated by a girl they had described as quiet and harmless. The cognitive dissonance between their expectations and reality was forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their behavior. Back in the school, Detective Chen was beginning her formal interviews, starting with Natalie. The conversation took place in an unused classroom with Christina present, and Chen's questions were thorough but respectful. "Walk me through your training," Chen said. "Who taught you? What did you learn? And how long have you been practicing?" Natalie described the weekend sessions with her father, the emphasis on situational awareness and de-escalation, and the specific techniques she had used to neutralize the 3 boys without causing serious injury. "Your father taught you well," Chen observed. "Everything you did was textbook self-defense. Appropriate force, minimum necessary escalation, immediate disengagement when the threat was neutralized. He always said the goal was to end the situation safely, not to win a fight." Natalie replied. Chen nodded, making notes and forming an increasingly clear picture of what had transpired. This hadn't been a fight between teenagers. It had been an attempted assault, stopped by someone with the training and composure to defend herself effectively. As the investigation continued into the evening, the ripple effects of the courtyard incident began spreading through Springdale in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. Social media posts were being shared across the community, parents were having difficult conversations with their children about bullying and racism, and everyone was beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their small town. The Springdale police station buzzed with unusual activity for a Wednesday morning. Detective Chen had arrived early to review the mountain of evidence that had accumulated overnight. 17 separate cell phone videos, dozens of witness statements, and a growing digital trail of social media posts that painted a comprehensive picture of what had transpired in the school courtyard. The videos were particularly damning for Maverick and his friends. Shot from multiple angles, they clearly showed the boys cornering Natalie, the racial slurs, Maverick's aggressive approach, and Natalie's purely defensive response. What struck Chen most was the calculated nature of the boys' behavior. This wasn't spontaneous teenage conflict, but a deliberate attempt to humiliate someone they perceived as vulnerable. Her phone rang as she finished reviewing the final video. Sheriff William Crawford's gruff voice carried the weight of 30 years in law enforcement and genuine concern about the political firestorm brewing in his jurisdiction. "Sarah, I've got the mayor breathing down my neck. 3 sets of prominent. Parents demanding arrests, and a school board meeting called for tonight that's going to be a circus. Tell me you've got this situation figured out." "I've got it figured out," Chen replied confidently. "The evidence is overwhelming. 3 students attempted to sexually assault a 4th student after subjecting her to racial harassment. The victim defended herself with appropriate force. It's textbook self-defense, and any prosecutor who tried to charge the girl would be laughed out of court. And the boys? That's where it gets interesting. They could be looking at assault charges, harassment based on race, and conspiracy. But I think there might be a better way to handle this." Crawford was quiet for a moment, recognizing the tone in Chen's voice that meant she had an idea brewing. "I'm listening." Colonel Lim called me this morning. He wants to come in and discuss alternatives to criminal charges. Says he has a proposal that might serve justice better than sending 3 teenagers through the system. What kind of proposal? He wouldn't say over the phone, but knowing his background, I'm guessing it involves accountability without destroying their futures. Military justice tends to focus on rehabilitation and making amends. Crawford sighed, feeling the weight of community expectations and political pressure. Set up the meeting, but Sarah, make sure everyone understands that we're not cutting any deals just because these boys have connected families. Justice is justice, regardless of who your daddy knows. An hour later, the conference room at the police station contained an unlikely assembly. Colonel Benjamin Lim sat across from Detective Chen and Sheriff Crawford, his posture relaxed but alert. Beside him, Master Sergeant David Thompson, his former unit member who now ran the Fort Braxton Veterans Center, reviewed a folder of documents with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers. "Gentlemen," Chen said, opening the meeting, "Colonel Lim has requested this discussion as an alternative to pursuing criminal charges against the 3 students who assaulted his daughter. I want to be clear that any agreement is contingent on the boys and their families accepting full responsibility for what happened." Benjamin nodded and opened his own folder. "Sheriff Crawford, Detective Chen, I appreciate you taking the time to hear this proposal. My daughter was the victim of a crime, and she has every right to see her attackers prosecuted to the full extent of the law." He paused, letting that statement settle before continuing. "However, as a career military officer, I've learned that sometimes the most effective justice comes from forcing people to confront the consequences of their actions and work to make amends. Simply putting these boys through the criminal justice system might satisfy our desire for punishment, but it won't address the underlying problems that led to this incident." Thompson leaned forward slightly. "What Colonel Lim is proposing is a structured accountability program based on military disciplinary principles. These boys would spend their summer in a veteran-led character development program that would teach them responsibility, respect, and service to others." "What exactly would that involve?" Crawford asked, his interest clearly piqued. Benjamin slid a detailed program outline across the table. 12 weeks of intensive character training, community service and education about the consequences of their actions. They would work directly with veterans who understand discipline and accountability. They would also make direct amends to the communities they've harmed, including presentations to younger students about the real cost of bullying and racism. Chen reviewed the proposal, impressed by its comprehensiveness and structure. This would be in lieu of criminal charges, if and only if all 3 boys and their families publicly acknowledge what happened, accept full responsibility for their actions, complete the program successfully, and demonstrate genuine change in their behavior, Benjamin said firmly. Any failure to meet these requirements would result in immediate prosecution for the original charges, Thompson added. We've run similar programs for young veterans who got into trouble adjusting to civilian life. The success rate is quite high when participants understand that this is their one chance to make things right. Sheriff Crawford studied the proposal, recognizing both its potential benefits and the political courage it would require to implement. "Colonel, I have to ask, why? Your daughter was the victim here. Why offer these boys a way out?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Sheriff, I've seen what hatred and violence do to communities. I've also seen what redemption can accomplish when people are forced to confront their actions and work to become better. These boys made terrible choices, but they're still 17 years old. If we can turn them into advocates against the kind of behavior they displayed, we serve justice better than if we simply punish them." Plus, Thompson interjected with a slight smile, 12 weeks of military-style discipline and community. Service isn't exactly getting off easy. These boys are going to work harder this summer than they've ever worked in their lives. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed logistics, legal requirements, and oversight mechanisms. By the time it concluded, Chen found herself cautiously optimistic about the proposal's potential to create real change rather than simply satisfying the desire for retribution. Meanwhile, at Springdale High School, the normal rhythms of a school day had been completely disrupted by the ongoing fallout from the previous day's incident. Students clustered in hallways, whispering about the police interviews. Teachers struggled to maintain focus in classrooms, buzzing with distraction. And Principal Morrison fielded a constant stream of phone calls from parents demanding answers. Natalie moved through this chaos with remarkable composure, attending her classes and completing her assignments as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and she could feel the shift in how other students looked at her, no longer invisible, no longer vulnerable, but not quite fitting into any existing social category either. During lunch, she sat with Emma Rodriguez and Madison Chen, two classmates who had approached her after witnessing the courtyard incident. Their conversation was interrupted when Tyler Davis, a senior who had never spoken to her before, approached their table with obvious nervousness. "Hey, Natalie," he said awkwardly. "I just wanted to say that what you did yesterday was amazing. Those guys have been terrorizing people for years, and nobody ever stood up to them before." Similar interactions occurred throughout the day, students thanking her for standing up to bullies, asking if she could teach them self-defense, or simply acknowledging her presence in ways they never had before. The social invisibility that had protected her for months was completely gone, replaced by a reputation that felt both empowering and isolating. In the administrative offices, Principal Morrison was dealing with a different kind of chaos. The school board had called an emergency meeting for that evening, and she knew it would be contentious. Richard Stone had been calling board members all morning, demanding Natalie's expulsion and threatening legal action against the school for failing to protect his son. Karen Blackwood, Maverick's mother, had taken a different approach, arriving at the school with a box of tissues and a story about her son being traumatized by an unprovoked attack. Her performance was polished and sympathetic, but Morrison had watched the video evidence and knew that sympathy was misplaced. The most challenging conversation came when Frank Hayes, Easton's father, arrived with a lawyer in tow. Hayes owned a successful construction company and was accustomed to solving problems through intimidation and financial pressure. His lawyer immediately began making threats about lawsuits and demanding access to Natalie's academic and disciplinary records. "My client's son was assaulted by a student who clearly has extensive martial arts training," the lawyer announced. "The school failed in its duty to protect students by allowing a weapon, in the form of a trained fighter, to attend classes with normal children." Morrison had dealt with aggressive parents before, but rarely with such a coordinated campaign. To rewrite obvious facts, she found herself grateful for Detective Chen's investigation and the clear video evidence that would make such distortions impossible to sustain. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when Ahmad Dorothy Lim appeared in the main office, asking to speak with Principal Morrison. At 70 years old, Dorothy moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned patience through decades of experience, but her dark eyes held an intensity that commanded immediate respect. "Principal Morrison," she said in her accented but precise English, "I am Natalie's grandmother. I came to thank you for handling this situation with fairness and wisdom." Morrison was surprised by the visit and touched by the elderly woman's gracious manner. "Mrs. Lim, your granddaughter showed remarkable composure during a very difficult situation. You should be proud of her." "I am proud," Dorothy replied. "But I am also concerned. In my experience, people who have been shown their weaknesses sometimes become dangerous in new ways. My granddaughter defended herself well, but the real test may come from what happens next." The wisdom in that observation stayed with Morrison throughout the rest of the afternoon, particularly as she prepared for the evening's school board meeting. Dorothy was right. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the broader consequences were just beginning to unfold. As the school day ended, the three boys at the center of the controversy were dealing with their own reckonings. Maverick sat in his family's living room while his parents argued about legal strategies and damage control, feeling increasingly disconnected from their efforts to portray him as a victim. The video evidence made their narrative impossible to sustain, and he was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences beyond social embarrassment. Easton faced a different kind of pressure from his father, who was less concerned about his son's behavior than about the family's reputation and business interests. Frank Hayes had built his construction company through relationships and favors, and having his son exposed as a racist bully threatened those carefully cultivated connections. Knox experienced perhaps the most honest reckoning of the three. His family lacked the resources and connections of the others, making legal maneuvering impossible. His parents were forced to confront the reality of what their son had done and the limited options available for addressing it. When Detective Chen called each family that evening to inform them about Colonel Lim's proposed alternative to criminal prosecution, the responses varied dramatically. The Stone family immediately rejected the idea, preferring to fight the charges. In court, the Hayes family wanted time to consult with their lawyer. Only the Fisher family expressed immediate interest in exploring alternatives that might help their son learn from his mistakes. That evening's school board meeting drew the largest crowd in Springdale's recent memory. The high school auditorium filled with parents, students, community members, and local media, all drawn by a story that had touched on fundamental questions of justice, accountability, and community values. Principal Morrison presented a factual summary of the incident and the school's response, carefully avoiding any language that might prejudice ongoing legal proceedings. Detective Chen provided an overview of the police investigation, emphasizing the clear evidence of self-defense and the serious nature of the charges the three boys potentially faced. But the evening's most powerful moment came when Colonel Benjamin Lim was invited to address the community. He spoke quietly but with unmistakable authority about his daughter's character, the reality of the assault she had faced, and his belief that true justice required accountability rather than simply punishment. "My daughter was attacked because three young men believed she was an easy target," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "They were wrong about her ability to defend herself, but they were right about something else. She is exactly the kind of person who deserves protection and respect in our community." He paused, making eye contact with various sections of the audience. "The question before us isn't whether these boys should face consequences for their actions. The question is what kind of consequences will best serve our community and help ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again." As the meeting continued into the night, it became clear that Springdale was grappling with issues much larger than a single incident between teenagers. The community was being forced to examine its values, its tolerance for bullying and racism, and its commitment to justice for all its members, regardless of their social status or family connections. The decisions made in the coming days would determine not just the fate of 4 teenagers, but the character of an entire community. The Fort Braxton Veterans Center occupied a sprawling complex of converted military buildings 30 miles outside Springdale, surrounded by Pennsylvania, farmland that rolled toward distant mountains. Master Sergeant David Thompson stood on the main building steps at dawn, watching the approach of 3 vehicles carrying very different passengers toward what would either be redemption or failure. 2 weeks had passed since the school board meeting that divided Springdale down predictable lines. The Stone family had maintained their legal fight until the district attorney made it clear that video evidence would make prosecution of Natalie impossible, while making convictions of the 3 boys virtually guaranteed. Faced with that reality, even Richard Stone's bluster had crumbled, and all 3 families had reluctantly agreed to Colonel Lim's alternative program. Knox Fisher stepped out of his family's aging pickup truck first, his shoulders hunched with genuine shame and uncertainty. His parents had used their savings to pay for the program, viewing it as their son's only chance to avoid a criminal record that would destroy his future. Knox carried a military surplus duffel bag that had belonged to his grandfather, a World War II veteran whose service had been one of the few sources of pride in the Fisher family's recent history. Easton Price emerged from his father's luxury SUV with visible reluctance, his expression cycling between defiance and anxiety. Frank Hayes had agreed to the program only after his lawyer confirmed that criminal convictions would impact federal contracting opportunities for his construction business. Easton's expensive luggage and designer clothes stood in stark contrast to Knox's humble preparations, but both boys shared the same underlying fear of the unknown. Maverick Stone's arrival in his family's BMW created the day's most awkward moment. His parents had accompanied him personally, and Richard Stone's last-minute attempt to negotiate special treatment was met with Thompson's polite but immovable refusal. Karen Stone's tears as she hugged her son goodbye seemed genuine, but Thompson had seen enough crocodile tears from family members to reserve judgment. "Gentlemen," Thompson said once the families had departed and the 3 boys stood uncertainly in the center's main courtyard, "welcome to your summer. For the next 12 weeks, this place will be your home, your school, and your chance to become the kind of men your communities need, instead of the kind they need protection from." The Fort Braxton program was Thompson's life's work, developed over 5 years of working with young veterans who had struggled to transition to civilian life. The principles were simple: accountability, service, and transformation through discipline and hard work. But applying those principles to civilian teenagers who had never faced real consequences for their actions would test every lesson Thompson had learned about human nature and redemption. The boys' first shock came when they were introduced to their living quarters, sparse dormitory rooms with 2 single beds each, basic furniture, and none of the creature comforts they were accustomed to. Maverick and Easton would be roommates, while Knox would share with David Martinez, a 17-year-old from Philadelphia, whose participation in the program stemmed from gang-related charges that had been diverted through Veterans Court. "This isn't summer camp," Staff Sergeant Maria Santos explained as she led them through orientation. Santos had served 2 deployments in Iraq before transitioning to youth counseling, and her no-nonsense demeanor immediately established that manipulation and privilege would carry no weight in this environment. "You're here because you made choices that hurt other people. Everything you do for the next 12 weeks will be focused on understanding those choices and learning to make better ones." The daily schedule was posted on each dormitory room wall: 0530 Reveille, 0600 physical training, 0700 breakfast, 0800 work detail, 1200 lunch, 1300 education sessions, 1600 community service, 1800 dinner, 1900 reflection and journaling, 2100 lights out. No phones, no internet, no contact with the outside world, except supervised family calls on Sundays. Knox adapted to the structure more quickly than his companions, perhaps because his family's financial struggles had already taught him that comfort was earned rather than guaranteed. He followed instructions without complaint, performed his assigned tasks competently, and seemed genuinely interested in the educational components about leadership and responsibility. Easton approached the program as a challenge to be conquered through his usual combination of intelligence and aggression. He excelled at the physical requirements and completed his work assignments efficiently, but Santos recognized the calculating nature of his compliance. Easton was performing rather than transforming, going through motions while waiting for the program to end. Maverick struggled most with the loss of status and special treatment. Accustomed to deference from teachers, coaches, and community members, he found the veteran's indifference to his background and achievements deeply unsettling. His attempts to charm or manipulate the staff were met with professional detachment that stripped away his primary tools for controlling social situations. The turning point for all three boys came during their third week, when Colonel Lim arrived for what Thompson called a reality session. The meeting took place in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom, with the boys seated across from Lim, Thompson, and Santos, while video footage from the school incident played on a large monitor. "I want you to watch this," Lim said, quietly, "and I want you to tell me what you see." The boys had seen portions of the footage before, but never the complete sequence from multiple angles with clear audio. Watching their own behavior, the racial slurs, the predatory positioning, the obvious intent to humiliate Natalie, forced them to confront the reality of what they had become. "That's not who I am," Maverick said when the video ended, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it is," Lim replied without hostility, but with absolute firmness. "That is exactly who you were in that moment. The question is whether it's who you choose to remain." Knox was the first to break, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to articulate his shame and confusion. "I don't know why we did that. I don't know what was wrong with us. You did it because you could," Santos said. "Because you had never faced real consequences for hurting other people, so you convinced yourselves that your behavior was normal or acceptable." Easton maintained his composure longer, but even he couldn't watch himself grabbing at Natalie without feeling sick. "She could have really hurt us," he said finally. "She should have," Thompson replied. "You attempted to sexually assault a 16-year-old girl. The fact that she chose to neutralize you without causing permanent injury shows more restraint and character than you demonstrated in that entire encounter." The session continued for 3 hours, forcing the boys to examine not just their actions, but the attitudes and beliefs that had led to those actions. For the first time, they were required to consider Natalie's perspective, her fear, her humiliation, her courage in standing up to 3 larger attackers. "I want you to understand something," Lim said as the session concluded. "My daughter didn't ask me to offer you this program. She was prepared to see you prosecuted to the full extent of the law. This opportunity exists because I believe that redemption serves justice better than simple punishment, but only if you're willing to do the work required for genuine change." The weeks that followed tested that commitment in ways the boys couldn't have anticipated. Their community service assignments took them to homeless shelters, veteran support organizations, and youth programs where they worked directly with people whose lives had been shaped by violence, poverty, and discrimination. Knox found himself particularly moved by his work at a shelter for domestic violence survivors, where his assigned tasks included maintaining the facility's playground and helping with children's activities. Interacting with kids who had witnessed their mothers being abused forced him to confront the real consequences of the kind of intimidation and control he had practiced at school. Easton's assignment to a veteran rehabilitation center brought him face to face with men and women who had sacrificed their bodies and minds in service to their country, only to struggle with addiction, homelessness, and mental health challenges upon their return. His initial resentment at being assigned grunt work gradually transformed into respect for both the veterans and the staff who served them. Maverick's community service proved most challenging because Thompson deliberately placed him in situations where his previous status meant nothing. Working in a food bank serving low-income families, he encountered classmates from Springdale whose families relied on assistance he had never imagined they needed. The experience shattered his assumptions about worthiness and social hierarchy. The educational components of the program proved equally transformative. Guest speakers included veterans who had overcome traumatic brain injuries, community leaders who had experienced racism and discrimination, and former gang members who had redirected their lives towards service and leadership. Dr. Patricia Williams, a trauma counselor who had worked with military sexual assault survivors, delivered perhaps the most powerful presentation during the boys' 6th week. Her description of the long-term psychological impacts of sexual harassment and assault created a framework for understanding the magnitude of what they had attempted to do to Natalie. Intent matters less than impact, Dr. Williams explained. Whether you meant to traumatize someone is irrelevant if your actions created trauma. The question is whether you're willing to take responsibility for that impact and work to ensure you never create it again. Meanwhile, back in Springdale, Natalie was experiencing her own form of transformation. The notoriety from the incident had completely altered her social position at school, bringing both opportunities and challenges she hadn't anticipated. Teachers treated her with new respect, administrators sought her input on anti-bullying initiatives, and several colleges had reached out after learning about her story through media coverage. But the attention also brought pressure and expectations that sometimes felt overwhelming. Other students approached her constantly seeking advice about dealing with bullies, asking for self-defense lessons, or simply wanting to be associated with someone who had become a local legend. The quiet invisibility she had once valued was completely gone, replaced by a spotlight that felt both empowering and isolating. Christina noticed the changes in her daughter during their evening walks around Liberty Commons. The conversations that had once focused on schoolwork and family now dominated by questions about responsibility and leadership. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Natalie said one evening as they paused by the park's memorial fountain. "I just wanted to defend myself and go back to my normal life." "Normal was never really an option after what happened," Christina replied gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry everyone else's expectations. You get to decide what kind of leader you want to be." The wisdom in her mother's words became clearer as the summer progressed, and reports from the Veterans Center indicated genuine progress among the 3 boys. Phone calls from Thompson described behavioral changes that went beyond mere compliance, suggesting that the program's combination of structure, service, and accountability was creating the foundation for real transformation. As the boys approached the halfway point of their program, they faced their most challenging assignment yet, preparing presentations about their experiences for delivery to incoming freshmen at Springdale High School. The presentations would need to acknowledge their actions, explain the consequences they had faced, and provide guidance for younger students about making better choices. For the first time since the program began, the 3 boys would need to work together as a team, combining their individual insights and growth into a unified message about accountability and change. The success or failure of that collaboration would determine not just their completion of the program, but their readiness to return to a community that was still deciding whether to embrace their redemption or reject it entirely. The real test of their transformation was about to begin. The Springdale High School Library had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. On a humid August afternoon, 2 weeks before the new school year began, Natalie Lim sat across from Knox Fisher in an arrangement that would have been unimaginable 4 months earlier. Between them lay a carefully negotiated agreement that had taken weeks to develop. The 3 boys would be allowed to complete their rehabilitation program by delivering their anti-bullying presentations to incoming freshmen, but only with Natalie's participation and approval. Knox looked different from the aggressive boy who had cornered her in the courtyard. 8 weeks of military-style discipline had stripped away 15 pounds of excess weight and replaced his perpetual sneer with something approaching humility. His hair was shorter, his posture straighter, and when he spoke, his words carried the careful consideration of someone who had learned that speech had consequences. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you," he said quietly, his hands folded on the table between them. "But I wanted you to hear directly from me what the program has taught us and what we're planning to tell the freshmen." Natalie studied his face with the same analytical attention her father had taught her to apply to potential threats. She saw genuine remorse in Knox's expression, but also recognized that redemption required more than feeling sorry. Real change meant accepting responsibility and working to prevent future harm. "Tell me," she said simply. Knox opened a notebook, filled with handwritten pages. Phones and computers weren't permitted at the Veterans Center, forcing participants to develop more deliberate communication habits. His presentation outline was meticulous, covering the incident itself, the program's impact on his thinking, and specific strategies for younger students to avoid the attitudes and behaviors that had led to his downfall. "We're calling it the real cost of being a bully," he explained. "Not just what it costs the victims, but what it costs us, our families, our futures, our ability to live with ourselves." As Knox described their planned approach, Natalie found herself impressed despite her reservations. The boys had clearly put serious thought into creating something meaningful rather than simply fulfilling a program requirement. Their presentation included statistical data about bullying's long-term effects, personal testimony about their own transformation, and interactive components designed to help younger students recognize and resist peer pressure. "What about Maverick and Easton?" Natalie asked. "Are they as committed to this as you seem to be?" Knox hesitated, his expressions suggesting internal conflict about how much honesty was appropriate. "Easton is complicated. He understands intellectually what we did wrong, and he's good at articulating the lessons we're supposed to have learned. But I'm not sure he feels it the way I do." "And Maverick?" "Maverick had the furthest to fall," Knox said carefully. "His whole identity was built around being untouchable, being able to do whatever he wanted without consequences. The program has broken that down completely, but I think he's still figuring out who he is without all the privilege and protection." The conversation was interrupted when Principal Morrison entered the library with Master Sergeant Thompson and Staff Sergeant Santos. The veterans had driven down from Fort Braxton to participate in these preliminary discussions, their presence lending weight to the proceedings and ensuring that any agreements made would be honored. "Miss Lim," Thompson said, taking a seat at their table, "Knox has been telling us about your conversation. I appreciate your willingness to consider our request." Natalie looked around the table at the assembled adults, people whose job it was to shape young minds and maintain community order. "I want to understand what you're really asking me to do. You want me to appear publicly with the boys who tried, to humiliate me and essentially endorse their redemption. We want you to participate in ensuring their redemption is genuine," Santos corrected. "Your presence and perspective would add credibility to their message, while also giving you a platform to share your own experiences and insights." Morrison leaned forward slightly, Natalie, I understand this puts you in a difficult position, but the reality is that these boys are returning to our school whether we like it or not. The question is whether they return as the same people who attacked you, or as advocates who can help prevent other students from making similar mistakes. The weight of that responsibility settled on Natalie's shoulders like a familiar burden. Since the courtyard incident, she had been asked repeatedly to be more than just a victim who had successfully defended herself. Teachers wanted her to mentor other bullied students. Administrators sought her input on policy changes, and now the community was asking her to participate in her attackers' rehabilitation. I need to speak with them, she said finally. All three of them together. If I'm going to endorse their transformation, I need to see it for myself. Thompson nodded approvingly. We can arrange that, but I want you to understand that what you'll see is three young men who've been forced to confront the worst aspects of themselves. They're not the same people who attacked you, but they're also not finished becoming whoever they're going to be. The meeting took place the following week at the Veterans Center, in the same conference room where the boys had first been forced to watch video evidence of their behavior. This time, the dynamic was completely different. Instead of facing judgment from authority figures, they were meeting with the person they had wronged, seeking something much more precious and difficult to obtain than official forgiveness. Maverick entered the room last, and Natalie was struck by how much smaller he seemed. The arrogant swagger that had defined his presence at school was completely gone, replaced by an uncertainty that made him appear younger and more vulnerable. His expensive clothes had been replaced by the simple uniform all program participants wore, and his carefully styled hair had been cut to military standards. "Natalie," he said, and his voice carried none of the casual cruelty she remembered. "Thank you for coming." Easton stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable months earlier. His red hair was shorter now, and the aggressive energy that had characterized his behavior had been replaced by something more controlled and purposeful. For the next 2 hours, the three boys presented their planned curriculum while Natalie listened and asked questions that tested their understanding and commitment. They walked through their analysis of the incident, their recognition of its impact on her and the broader community, and their proposals for helping younger students avoid similar behavior. "What happens when you go back to school and your old friends want you to resume your previous roles?" Natalie asked. "When maintaining your new values makes you less popular or powerful?" The question clearly made all three boys uncomfortable, but Knox answered first. "I think I've learned that the kind of power we had before wasn't real power. It was just the ability to hurt people who couldn't fight back effectively. Real strength protects people instead of preying on them." Easton's response was more analytical, but seemed genuine. "The program has taught us that leadership based on fear and intimidation isn't sustainable. Eventually, you run out of people willing to be victims, or you encounter someone like you who won't be intimidated." Maverick struggled most with the question, his answer revealing the depth of his identity crisis. "I honestly don't know who I'm going to be when I go back to school. Everything I thought I knew about myself was based on things that turned out to be false or harmful. I guess I'll find out what's left when those things are gone." His honesty was perhaps more convincing than confident declarations would have been. Natalie recognized the vulnerability in his admission and found herself believing that his transformation, however incomplete, was genuine. The presentation they outlined was comprehensive and thoughtful, incorporating elements that addressed both the emotional and practical aspects of bullying prevention. They planned to share their story honestly, including the racist elements that had motivated their behavior and the sense of entitlement that had made them believe their actions were acceptable. We want to tell them about the moment you made us realize how wrong we were, Easton said. Not just that you could defend yourself, but that we had become the kind of people who would attack someone we thought was helpless. The most important part, Knox added, is helping them understand that bullying isn't just about individual cruelty. It's about systems and attitudes that make some people feel like they're worth more than others. As the meeting concluded, Natalie found herself facing a decision that would define not just her senior year, but her role in the community's healing process. The boys' transformation seemed genuine, but she also understood that participating in their redemption would require her to relive her trauma repeatedly for the benefit of others. "I'll do it," she said finally, but with conditions. The conditions she outlined were non-negotiable. Any presentation would include her perspective as the victim, would acknowledge the racist motivations behind the attack, and would emphasize that self-defense was only one part of addressing bullying. Systemic change in school culture and adult intervention were equally important. Most importantly, she concluded, this isn't about forgiveness or redemption. This is about education and prevention. Whether you've earned forgiveness is between you and yourselves. What matters for these presentations is whether we can help other students make better choices. Thompson smiled at her clarity and strength. That's exactly the right approach, Miss Lim. Redemption isn't something you give to someone else. It's something they earn through their actions over time. As August drew to a close and the new school year approached, word spread through Springdale about the upcoming presentations. The response was mixed. Some community members praised the innovative approach to restorative justice, while others questioned whether the boys deserved a platform to share their stories so soon after their offense. The controversy intensified when local media picked up the story, framing it as either a groundbreaking example of rehabilitation or a dangerous precedent that gave attackers too much benefit of the doubt. Editorial writers debated the wisdom of allowing the boys to return to school at all, while social media discussions devolved into broader arguments about accountability, privilege, and second chances. Through it all, Natalie maintained her focus on the practical goal of preventing future incidents. Her summer had been spent preparing not just for the presentations, but for her senior year as a visible leader in a community still processing the events of the previous spring. The three boys completed their program at Fort Braxton with commendations from Thompson and Santos, but their real test would come when they returned to the social environment where their original behavior had flourished. The Veterans Center had given them tools and perspectives, but applying those lessons while navigating the complex pressures of high school would require daily choices that no program could make for them. As Labor Day weekend arrived in Springdale, prepared for another school year, everyone involved in the story understood that the presentations would mark not an ending, but a new beginning. The boys would have to prove their transformation through sustained behavior change. Natalie would continue navigating her role as an unwilling symbol of resistance, and the community would learn whether second chances could coexist with accountability. The most important test was about to begin. The first day of senior year at Springdale High School carried an electric tension that had nothing to do with normal back-to-school excitement. Students clustered in hallways whispering about the return of the three boys who had become infamous throughout the community, while teachers prepared for what they knew would be an emotionally charged day of presentations to incoming freshmen. Natalie arrived at school 30 minutes early, as had become her habit since the spring incident. She used the quiet time to center herself in the library, reviewing her notes and mentally preparing for what would be one of the most difficult days of her high school career. The presentation materials were spread across the table before her. Statistics about bullying's long-term effects, screenshots from the social media harassment that had followed the boys' actions, and her own carefully written account of the Attack and its aftermath. Emma Rodriguez found her there, settling into the adjacent chair with the comfortable familiarity of a friendship that had deepened over the summer months. Emma had become Natalie's closest confidant, someone who understood the pressure of unwanted attention and the complexity of forgiving without forgetting. "You don't have to do this," Emma said quietly, echoing a conversation they had repeated. "Throughout August, nobody would blame you if you changed your mind." Natalie looked up from her materials, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I know, but if I don't participate, the presentations become about their redemption instead of prevention. This way, the freshmen hear from both perspectives." The morning's first challenge came when Maverick, Easton, and Knox entered the library together, moving with the careful precision that had been drilled into them at Fort Braxton. Their appearance sparked immediate attention from other early arriving students, some curious, others hostile, all intensely interested in seeing how the dynamic would play out. Maverick approached their table with visible nervousness, his hands steady, but his voice slightly strained. "Good morning, Natalie. Are you ready for this?" The question carried layers of meaning beyond its surface politeness. All four teenagers understood that the day would test not just their preparation, but their ability to work together despite their complicated history. The presentations would either demonstrate genuine transformation or reveal that their collaboration was merely performance. "I'm ready," Natalie replied, then added with characteristic directness, "Are you?" Knox answered for the group, his voice carrying the earnest conviction that had emerged during his time at the Veterans Center. "We've been ready since we understood what we really did to you. Today is about making sure other students don't make mistakes." The first presentation was scheduled for second period, with an audience of approximately 100 incoming freshmen assembled in the school auditorium. Principal Morrison had spent weeks preparing both students and parents for what would be an unprecedented event in the school's history, perpetrators and victim working together to prevent future incidents. As they gathered backstage, the tension was palpable. Easton paced nervously, reviewing his notes for the dozenth time, while Knox sat quietly in meditation posture that Santos had taught him for managing anxiety. Maverick stood apart from the others, his internal struggle visible in the way he kept clenching and unclenching his fists. "Remember what Thompson told us," Knox said to his former companions. "We're not here to ask for forgiveness or make ourselves feel better. We're here to educate." Natalie overheard the reminder and felt a surge of respect for Knox's growth. Of the three boys, he had embraced the program's lessons most completely, transforming from follower to leader in ways that seemed authentic rather than calculated. When they took the stage, the auditorium fell into complete silence. The freshman class had heard rumors and fragments of the story, but seeing the actual participants together created a powerful visual that commanded immediate attention. Natalie stood at a podium to the left, while the three boys shared a table on the right, the physical arrangement emphasizing both separation and collaboration. Maverick spoke first, his voice clear but humble as he began with the words he had practiced for weeks. "My name is Maverick Stone, and 7 months ago I was a bully who thought I could do whatever I wanted to whoever I wanted. I was wrong, and I'm here to tell you how that mistake almost destroyed my life and the lives of people I hurt." His opening was followed by Knox's statistical presentation about bullying's prevalence and long-term effects, delivered with the precision of someone who had learned to value facts over feelings. The data was sobering: suicide rates among bullied students, academic achievement impacts, and the correlation between school harassment and adult mental health problems. Easton's segment focused on the psychology of group behavior, explaining how individual moral judgment could be compromised by peer pressure and social hierarchy. His analysis was sophisticated and self-aware, acknowledging the ways he had abandoned his own values to maintain his position in their toxic social circle. But the presentation's most powerful moment came when Natalie stepped to the microphone and began sharing her perspective as both victim and unwilling symbol of resistance. "When those 3 boys cornered me in the courtyard," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium, "they thought they were picking on someone who couldn't fight back. They were partially right. I am smaller than them. I was outnumbered, and I had no social protection from their harassment." She paused, making eye contact with various sections of the audience. But they were wrong about something crucial. They assumed that being quiet meant being weak, that being different meant being inferior, and that being isolated meant being helpless. Those assumptions cost them everything they thought they valued about themselves. The freshmen were completely absorbed, many taking notes while others simply stared with fascination at someone who had become a local legend. Natalie's reputation had preceded her, but hearing her speak directly about the experience gave her story human dimensions that rumors couldn't capture. "I want you to understand that self-defense was only part of what happened that day," she continued. "The real victory wasn't that I could protect myself physically. It was that I refused to accept their definition of my worth. That's something every person in this room can do, regardless of their size or strength or social status." The Q&A session that followed revealed the depth of thought the freshmen had given to these issues. Their questions ranged from practical requests for bullying, response strategies, to philosophical inquiries about forgiveness and redemption. One student asked directly whether Natalie had forgiven her attackers, prompting the most delicate moment of the entire presentation. "Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who hurt you," Natalie replied carefully. "It's something you give yourself when you're ready to stop carrying anger. These 3 have worked hard to understand and change their behavior, and I respect that effort. But respect and forgiveness are different things, and both have to be earned over time through consistent actions." Maverick's response to that answer provided perhaps the clearest evidence of his transformation. Instead of defensive protest or self-pity, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "That's exactly right. We don't deserve forgiveness just because we feel sorry or completed a program. We have to prove through our daily choices that we've really changed." The presentation concluded with concrete strategies for bystander intervention, reporting procedures, and resources for students experiencing harassment. But its emotional impact extended far beyond practical information. The freshmen had witnessed something unprecedented in their experience: accountability without destruction, consequences that led to growth rather than punishment. The day included 2 more presentations to different groups of freshmen, each building on lessons learned from the previous session. By the final presentation, the 4 participants had developed a rhythm that felt natural rather than rehearsed, their individual contributions weaving together into a comprehensive message about choice, consequence, and change. The real test, however, came during lunch period when the boys faced their first uncontrolled social interaction since returning to school. The cafeteria buzzed with tension as other students watched to see how former king of the school Maverick would handle his dramatically reduced status. The answer surprised everyone, including Maverick himself. Instead of attempting to reclaim his previous position or sulking about his fall from grace, he quietly joined Knox and Easton at a table near the windows and began eating without fanfare. When younger students approached seeking autographs or selfies, treating them like celebrities rather than cautionary tales, all 3 politely declined and redirected conversations toward the serious messages they were trying to convey. Their most significant test came when Derek Martinez, a senior football player who had been absent during the spring incident, attempted to resume the kind of aggressive teasing that had characterized their previous social interactions. Well, Derek said loudly enough to attract attention from surrounding tables. "Look who's back from summer camp! Did you boys learn how to play nice with the other children?" The old maverick would have responded with escalating aggression, using his social position to crush Derek's challenge and reassert dominance. The new version looked up calmly and said, "We learned that the kind of behavior you're demonstrating right now has serious consequences. You might want to think about that." Derek's mocking laughter died when he realized that other students weren't joining in. The social dynamics that had once supported casual cruelty had shifted during the boy's absence, replaced by awareness that such behavior might carry real costs. Derek found himself isolated in his aggression, facing disapproving looks from classmates who had heard the morning's presentations. Knox reinforced Maverick's response by standing and addressing Derek directly. "If you want to talk about what we learned this summer, I'm happy to explain it. But if you're just looking for someone to push around, you should understand that we don't do that anymore, and we won't stand by while others do it either." The confrontation dissolved when Derek realized he lacked the audience and support necessary to sustain his challenge. He retreated to another table, leaving the three boys to finish their lunch in peace, while other students began approaching them with genuine questions about the rehabilitation program and their presentations. As the day concluded, Principal Morrison gathered the 4 participants in her office to debrief their first day back together. The presentations had been more successful than anyone dared hope, generating thoughtful discussion rather than controversy, and establishing a new framework for addressing bullying at Springdale High. "I'm proud of all of you," Morrison said, looking around the room at 4 teenagers who had grown considerably since their last meeting in this office. "You've demonstrated that accountability and education can work together to create positive change, but the day's success also highlighted ongoing challenges. Natalie had handled the spotlight with characteristic grace, but Morrison could see the exhaustion in her expression, the cost of repeatedly reliving trauma for educational purposes. The boys had performed admirably, but their real test would come in the weeks and months ahead as they navigated daily temptations to resume old patterns. "This is just the beginning," Morrison reminded them. "What you accomplish today matters, but what you do tomorrow and next week and next month will determine whether this experience truly changed things or was just an impressive performance." As they prepared to leave, Knox approached Natalie. "One final time, thank you," he said simply, "not for forgiving us, but for giving us the chance to do something meaningful with what we learned." Natalie studied his face and saw sincerity that reminded her of her father's teachings about honor and service. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "Thank me in a year if you're still the person you were today." The challenge was issued and accepted. The real test of transformation would unfold not in dramatic presentations, but in daily choices, small moments of integrity, and the gradual rebuilding of trust that had been shattered by a few minutes of cruelty in a school courtyard. The work of redemption was just beginning. 3 months into the school year, Springdale High School had settled into a new rhythm that few could have predicted the previous spring. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. Change rarely was, but in small daily interactions, classroom dynamics, and hallway conversations, evidence of deeper shifts became increasingly apparent. Natalie discovered this evolution most clearly during her work with the newly formed peer mediation program, an initiative that had grown directly from the success of the anti-bullying presentations. What began as a school administration response to prevent future incidents had become something more comprehensive, a student-led effort to address conflicts before they escalated to violence or harassment. The program's weekly meetings took place In Mrs. Wells' history classroom, where 15 carefully selected students from different grades and social groups gathered to discuss cases, develop intervention strategies, and learn advanced conflict resolution techniques. Natalie had been reluctant to join initially, wary of taking on additional responsibilities that might cast her further in the role of unwilling counselor to her peers. But the program's first major test had convinced her of its value. 2 weeks. Earlier, a group of junior girls had begun systematically excluding and mocking Sarah Kim, a sophomore whose family had recently moved from California. The harassment included subtle social isolation tactics, cruel social media posts, and deliberate attempts to sabotage her academic group projects. In previous years, such behavior might have continued unchecked until it escalated to more serious bullying or forced Sarah to transfer schools. But now, multiple students recognized the pattern and reported it to the mediation program, which intervened with swift and effective action. The mediators arranged a facilitated discussion between Sarah and her harassers, supervised by trained student peers rather than adult administrators. The conversation forced the junior girls to confront the impact of their behavior while giving Sarah a platform to explain how their actions affected her daily experience at school. What struck me most, Natalie told her parents during dinner that evening, was how quickly things changed once the girls understood they were being held accountable. They genuinely didn't realize how cruel they had become, or how their behavior was affecting someone else's ability to feel safe at school. Colonel Lim looked up from his meal with the analytical expression Natalie recognized as his way of processing complex information. That's consistent with what we've observed in military leadership situations. Most harmful behavior stems from failure to consider consequences rather than deliberate malice. The important thing, Christina added, is that the system worked. Problems were identified and addressed before they became traumatic for everyone involved. The mediation program's success had broader implications for the 3 boys whose transformation had inspired its creation. Knox had become one of the program's most effective mediators, his experience as both perpetrator and participant in rehabilitation giving him unique credibility with students on both sides of conflicts. His ability to speak authentically about the progression from casual cruelty to serious harm made him particularly effective with potential bullies who were just beginning to display problematic behavior. Easton approached mediation with characteristic analytical intelligence, developing systematic approaches to conflict resolution that other students found helpful and practical. He had created a flow chart of intervention strategies that helped mediators identify the most appropriate response to different types of disputes, from simple misunderstandings to complex social manipulation. Maverick's role in the program proved more complicated, as his previous status as social leader created both opportunities and obstacles. Some students remained suspicious of his motives, viewing his participation as an attempt to rehabilitate his image rather than genuine commitment to helping others. But others found his perspective valuable precisely because he understood how social hierarchies functioned and could identify power dynamics that less socially sophisticated mediators might miss. The real test of their growth came during homecoming week, when traditional school rivalries and social pressures created numerous opportunities for conflicts to escalate. The mediation program handled 17 separate cases during those 5 days, ranging from disputes over dance dates to more serious allegations of theft and harassment. The most challenging case involved Brad Coleman, a senior hockey player, who had begun targeting Lucas Chang, a freshman whose academic achievements in advanced mathematics had earned him recognition that Brad found threatening. The harassment included physical intimidation in hallways, destruction of Lucas's textbooks, and increasingly aggressive confrontations that seemed designed to provoke a reaction. When the case was brought to the mediation program, Knox volunteered to take the lead, recognizing patterns in Brad's behavior that mirrored his own past actions. The initial meeting between Knox and Brad revealed the depth of insight Knox had gained about the psychology of bullying. "You're picking on Lucas because you're afraid," Knox said directly, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had learned from his veteran center training. "You're afraid that his success makes you look inadequate, so you're trying to tear him down instead of building yourself up." Brad's defensive anger was immediate and predictable. "I'm not afraid of some nerdy freshman. He just needs to learn his place." "That's exactly what I used to think," Knox replied calmly. "I used to believe that hurting other people somehow made me stronger or more important. But all it really did was make me a person other people were afraid of, which isn't the same thing as being respected." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Knox sharing specific examples from his own experience while challenging Brad to consider the long-term consequences of his behavior. By the session's end, Brad hadn't fully committed to changing his approach, but he had agreed to participate in facilitated discussions with Lucas and to reflect on whether his actions aligned with the kind of person he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Natalie's own evolution continued in directions she hadn't anticipated. Her academic achievements had attracted attention from several prestigious universities, but more significantly, her leadership during the crisis had opened doors to opportunities focused on social justice and conflict resolution. A professor from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service had contacted her directly after learning about the Springdale mediation program, suggesting she consider international relations as a field where her combination of cultural awareness, conflict, resolution skills, and personal courage could make a significant impact. "You've demonstrated that you can remain calm under pressure, work with people who have harmed you, and create positive change from difficult circumstances," Professor Janet Martinez had written in her email. "These are exactly the qualities we need in future diplomats and international mediators." The possibility of channeling her experiences into a career focused on preventing and resolving conflicts appealed to Natalie, though she remained cautious about letting others' expectations define her future path. Her conversations with Emma and other close friends revealed ongoing tension between her desire for normal teenage experiences and the leadership role the community had thrust upon her. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just stayed invisible," she confided to Emma during one of their evening study sessions. "Everything was simpler when nobody expected me to be anyone special." Emma looked up from her calculus homework with the direct honesty that characterized their friendship. "But you were never really invisible, were you? You were just hiding your strength because you thought it would make life easier." The observation stayed with Natalie as she prepared for what would become the program's most significant challenge, mediating a conflict that directly involved her own past trauma. The case emerged when Jessica Blackwood, Maverick's younger sister, reported that she was being harassed by a group of sophomores who were using her brother's past behavior to justify cruel treatment of her. The harassment included constant references to the courtyard incident, mocking suggestions that she might attack innocent students like her brother, and deliberate social isolation designed to punish her for Maverick's actions. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jessica had been one of Natalie's most vocal supporters during the immediate aftermath of the incident, publicly stating that her brother deserved consequences for his behavior. Her current harassment represented a kind of delayed retaliation that none of the mediation program's protocols had anticipated. When Principal Morrison approached Natalie about taking the case, the request created an ethical dilemma that had no clear resolution. Mediating on behalf of Maverick's sister would require Natalie to set aside her own trauma and advocate for someone connected to her attackers, but refusing the case might undermine the program's effectiveness and Jessica's access to support. "I can't ask you to do this," Morrison said during their private meeting. "It's beyond anything we should expect from someone in your position. But Jessica specifically requested you as her mediator, and I think she trusts you in ways she doesn't trust other adults or students." Natalie spent a sleepless night considering the request, discussing it with her parents, and reviewing the values that had guided her decisions throughout the ordeal. Colonel Lim's perspective proved particularly helpful, framing the decision in terms of service rather than personal cost. "The question isn't whether you owe anything to Jessica or her family," he said. "The question is whether helping her aligns with your values and your vision of the kind of community you want to live in." The next morning, Natalie accepted the case with carefully defined boundaries and support structures. She would work with Jessica, but not alone. Knox would serve as co-mediator, providing both his experience with similar situations and a buffer against any appearance of impropriety. Their first meeting with Jessica revealed a young woman struggling with guilt, anger, and confusion about her place in the community's ongoing healing process. At 14, she was old enough to understand the seriousness of what her brother had done, but too young to fully process the complex emotions surrounding forgiveness, accountability, and family loyalty. "I hate what Maverick did to you," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to Natalie directly. "I was so angry at him, and I thought if I said that publicly, people would understand that I'm not like him. But now they're treating me like I am, and I don't know what to do." Natalie felt an unexpected surge of protective sympathy for the younger girl, recognizing in Jessica's confusion echoes of her own struggle with unwanted attention and community expectations. The harassment Jessica faced was unjust and cruel, regardless of its connection to past events. "You're not responsible for your brother's choices," Natalie said firmly. "And you shouldn't have to carry the burden of other people's anger about what he did. That's not how justice works." Over the following weeks, Natalie and Knox worked with Jessica to develop strategies for addressing the harassment while also facilitating conversations with her tormentors. The process was emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, requiring delicate navigation of trauma, family dynamics, and community politics. But it also demonstrated the mediation program's potential to address complex, multi-layered conflicts that traditional disciplinary approaches couldn't handle effectively. By the time Jessica's case was resolved, the sophomore girls harassing her had not only stopped their cruel behavior but had also gained deeper understanding of how secondary victimization worked and why it was harmful. The success created momentum for expanding the program beyond Springdale High School. Other districts began requesting information about their model, and the state education department expressed interest in developing statewide guidelines based on their experience. As October gave way to November, Natalie found herself reflecting on how profoundly her life had changed since that spring afternoon in the courtyard. The quiet girl who had simply wanted to get through high school unnoticed had become a recognized leader in restorative justice, a sought-after speaker at education conferences, and a symbol of resilience for young people facing harassment and discrimination. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that strength could be expressed through service, that healing could coexist with accountability, and that the most meaningful victories often came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies. The transformation of Springdale was far from complete, but its direction had been irreversibly altered by the choices made by 4 teenagers who had learned that consequences could lead to growth, that accountability could foster redemption, and that the most powerful changes often began with a single moment of courage in the face of cruelty. The final chapter of their story was still being written. The late May sunshine streamed through the tall windows of Springdale High School's auditorium as the class of 2025 prepared for graduation. In the controlled chaos of final rehearsals, cap and gown adjustments, and tearful farewells, few people would have predicted that the most meaningful moment of the ceremony would come not from the valedictorian's speech or the principal's farewell address, but from a presentation that had never appeared on any official program. Natalie Lim stood at the edge of the stage, watching her classmates practice their processional while holding a manila folder that contained something unprecedented. In Springdale's graduation history, a joint statement from herself, Maverick Stone, Easton Price, and Knox Fisher that would serve as their final contribution to the school community that had witnessed their transformation. The idea had emerged during a mediation program meeting 3 weeks earlier, when Knox had suggested that their graduation might provide an opportunity to offer closure to a story that had captivated and divided the community for over a year. The suggestion had sparked hours of discussion about appropriate tone, message, and format, ultimately resulting in a carefully crafted presentation that none of them could have imagined creating together 14 months earlier. Principal Morrison approached Natalie with the mixture of pride and nostalgia that characterized her interactions with seniors, but particularly with students who had shaped their school's culture in meaningful ways. "Are you nervous about this afternoon?" Morrison asked, though she already knew the answer from Natalie's composed demeanor. "Not nervous," Natalie replied thoughtfully. "More like ready to close this chapter and move on to whatever comes next." The whatever comes next for Natalie included a full scholarship to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where she planned to study international conflict resolution with an emphasis on restorative justice approaches. Her essay about transforming personal trauma into community healing had impressed admissions officers, but more importantly, it had crystallized her own understanding of how individual experiences could contribute to broader social change. As the morning progressed, family members began arriving for the ceremony. Colonel Benjamin Lim and Christina took their seats in the section reserved for military families, joined by Ama Dorothy, whose pride in her granddaughter's achievements was evident in every gesture and expression. Nearby, the Stone, Price, and Fisher families arranged themselves with the careful politeness of people who had learned to coexist despite complicated histories. The transformation of these family relationships had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire ordeal. Richard Stone's initial outrage and denial had gradually given way to grudging respect for Colonel Lim's approach to justice, though their interactions remained formal and limited. Karen Stone had developed an unexpected friendship with Christina Lim, bonded by their shared experience of watching their children navigate public scrutiny and personal growth. Frank Price had undergone the most dramatic change, becoming an advocate for the Veteran Center program after seeing its impact on his son. His construction company now provided pro bono services for veteran housing projects, and he frequently spoke at business community meetings about the value of restorative justice, approaches to employee discipline and conflict resolution. The Fisher family's transformation was quieter but no less significant. Daniel and Amy Fisher had watched their son evolve from an angry, directionless teenager into a young man with clear values and purpose. Knox's acceptance to the University of Pennsylvania's social work program represented not just personal achievement, but a fundamental shift in his family's expectations about education, service, and community engagement. As the ceremony began, the traditional elements proceeded with expected dignity: the processional, welcome remarks, recognition of academic achievements, and scholarship announcements. But the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of anticipation, as the audience waited for what everyone knew would be the afternoon's most significant moment. When Principal Morrison called the 4 students to the podium, the auditorium fell into complete silence. Parents stopped talking, younger siblings ceased fidgeting, and even the usual rustle of programs and movement stilled as hundreds of people focused their attention on 4 teenagers who had become symbols of both the worst and best possibilities of their community. Natalie spoke first, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the audience that had witnessed every stage of their journey. 14 months ago, something happened in our school's courtyard that forced all of us to examine our values, our assumptions, and our commitment to creating a safe community for everyone, she began. What started as a moment of violence and hatred became a catalyst for conversations about accountability, redemption, and the kind of school culture we wanted to build together. She paused, making eye contact with various sections of the audience before continuing. I've been asked many times whether I forgive the 3 young men who attacked me. The honest answer is that forgiveness was never the right question. The right question was whether we could transform that moment of harm into something that protected future students from similar experiences. Knox stepped forward next, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had developed through months of mediation work and community service. When I think about the person I was 14 months ago, I feel ashamed and grateful in equal measure, he said. Ashamed of the cruelty I was capable of, and grateful for the opportunity to become someone different. But I want everyone to understand that change didn't happen because I felt sorry or because I faced consequences. It happened because I was forced to see the real impact of my actions and given tools to become a better person. He looked directly at the underclassmen in the audience. The lesson isn't that bad behavior gets forgiven if you apologize sincerely enough. The lesson is that every choice you make shapes who you become, and you have the power to choose growth over destruction, service over selfishness. Easton's contribution focused on the systematic changes the school had implemented to prevent future incidents. The peer mediation program, the revised harassment policies, and the emphasis on bystander intervention didn't emerge automatically from good intentions, he explained. They required sustained effort from students, teachers, administrators, and families working together to create accountability systems that actually work. His analytical nature showed in his presentation of statistics a 60% reduction in reported bullying incidents, increased academic achievement among previously marginalized students, and measurable improvements in school climate surveys. But he grounded these numbers in human terms, describing specific cases where early intervention had prevented escalation to serious harm. Maverick's portion of the presentation proved most challenging, both for him to deliver and for the audience to receive. His fall from social prominence had been dramatic and public, but his growth had been equally visible to those willing to observe it. I used to believe that leadership meant having power over other people, he said, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the admission. I thought respect was something you demanded rather than earned, and I convinced myself that hurting people who couldn't fight back somehow proved my strength. He faced the audience directly, no longer the arrogant teenager who had ruled the school's social hierarchy through intimidation and privilege. Real leadership, I've learned, means using whatever advantages you have to protect and support others. Real strength comes from admitting when you're wrong and working to repair the damage you've caused. His final words carried particular weight because they came from someone who had once embodied the attitudes and behaviors the community was working to eliminate. Change is possible for anyone willing to do the work required. But that work never ends, and it has to be proven through actions rather than words. The presentation concluded with a joint statement that all four had crafted together, emphasizing their shared commitment to carrying the lessons of their experience into their adult lives. "We want to leave you with this thought," Natalie said, speaking for all of them. "The test of a community isn't whether problems occur. They always will. The test is how quickly and effectively those problems are addressed, how fairly justice is administered, and how successfully healing and prevention are achieved." Springdale High School became a better place, not because conflict disappeared, but because we learned to handle conflict in ways that served everyone's interests. That's a lesson we'll carry with us wherever we go, and we hope you'll carry it forward in the years to come. The audience's response was immediate and sustained applause, but more meaningfully, it was followed by dozens of individual conversations throughout the remainder of the ceremony. Underclassmen approached the four speakers with questions about the mediation program. Parents expressed gratitude for the positive changes in school culture, and community members acknowledged that the experience had influenced their own approaches to conflict and accountability. As the official ceremony concluded and families gathered for photographs and celebrations, Detective Sarah Chen made her way through the crowd to speak with the four graduates. Her investigation had officially closed months earlier, but she had maintained informal contact with all the participants, curious about their long-term development. "I wanted to tell you all something," she said when she found them together near the stage. "In 15 years of law enforcement, I've seen a lot of young people make terrible mistakes. Most of them either never accept responsibility for their actions or accept it superficially without making real changes. What you four accomplished is genuinely rare and genuinely meaningful." She looked specifically at the three boys. "You proved that accountability and redemption can coexist, that consequences can lead to growth rather than just punishment. That matters not just for your own futures, but for everyone who witnessed your transformation." To Natalie, she added, "And you demonstrated that justice doesn't always require destruction of the people who harm us. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is insisting that the perpetrators become better people. That takes incredible strength and wisdom." As the afternoon wound down and families began departing, the four graduates found themselves alone for perhaps the final time as a group. The relationships they had developed were unprecedented and indefinable, not quite friendship, but deeper than mere acquaintance, built on shared experience of crisis, accountability, and growth. "So this is it," Knox said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. "No," Natalie replied with characteristic precision. "This is the beginning. Everything we've learned here, everything we've built together, now we get to see whether it holds up in the real world." Maverick nodded, understanding the challenge implicit in her words. "We'll be in different cities, different schools, different lives, but people will know our story, and they'll be watching to see whether the changes were real or just performance. Then we'd better make sure they were real," Easton said with a slight smile. As they prepared to part ways, Knox pulled out a small card that he handed to each of them. It contained contact information and a simple message. "Accountability partners, because transformation is a lifetime commitment." The gesture was typical of Knox's thoughtful approach to maintaining the growth he had achieved, but it also represented something larger. An understanding that change required ongoing effort and mutual support. 3 years later, when Knox was Completing his master's degree in social work at Penn, Easton was studying business and non-profit management at Carnegie Mellon. Maverick was working with at-risk youth through AmeriCorps, and Natalie was interning with a conflict resolution organization in Washington, D.C. They would still exchange regular messages about challenges, successes, and lessons learned. Their story had become part of Springdale's institutional memory, referenced in training materials for new teachers, included in orientation programs for incoming students, and cited by education researchers studying restorative justice approaches. But more importantly, it had established precedents and systems that continued protecting students long after its original participants had graduated. The peer mediation program had expanded to include training for parents and community members, creating a network of conflict resolution resources that extended beyond the school walls. The Veterans Center had developed partnerships with 3 other school districts, offering their rehabilitation program to young people throughout the region. Most significantly, the culture shift that began with 4 teenagers learning to transform. Conflict into growth had created ripple effects that touched every aspect of community life. City council meetings featured structured dialogue processes, local businesses implemented mediation protocols for workplace disputes, and youth sports. Leagues adopted zero-tolerance policies for harassment that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. As Natalie walked across the Georgetown campus on a crisp October morning during her sophomore year, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that spring afternoon when 3 boys had tried to humiliate her in a school courtyard. The girl who had once hoped for invisibility was now preparing to address a United Nations Youth Forum about community-based approaches to preventing violence. The transformation hadn't always been easy or comfortable. Leadership required sacrifices of privacy and normalcy that she sometimes resented, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities she couldn't have imagined, opened doors to opportunities that would allow her to help communities around. The world developed their own capacity for healing and justice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Knox, now working as a counselor at a residential facility for troubled teenagers in Philadelphia. Just helped a kid work through his first conflict resolution session. He reminded me of us at the beginning, scared, angry, but willing to try something different. The work continues. Natalie smiled as she typed her reply. The work always continues. That's what makes it worthwhile. The story that began with 30 seconds of violence in a Pennsylvania school courtyard had become a lifetime commitment to proving that people could change, communities could heal, and justice could serve growth rather than just punishment. It was a lesson that would echo through countless other lives, in countless other moments when someone had to choose between destruction and redemption. The choice, as always, belonged to each individual. But the example had been set, the systems had been built, and the possibility had been proven. That was legacy enough for anyone. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.